first tonight. 3 years ago, when Maine was marking our bicentennial, our go-to source for Maine's 200 years of history was Earle Shettleworth, the official Maine state historian.
Last week, he was honored by the Maine Historical Society with its History Maker Award. 207's Don Kerrigan got together with Earle Shettleworth a few days ago to talk about his love for Maine's past and found out it began almost as long ago as he can remember.
In cities and towns all over Maine, including here in downtown Hallowell, our state's history is all around. For over 50 years, Earle Shettleworth has been helping to research, preserve, and share that history with the rest of us, which is why the Maine Historical Society decided it was time to give him a sort of Lifetime Achievement Award. 60 years after his work began, Earle Shettleworth was being honored by the Maine Historical Society, the organization he joined at age 14. Most 14-year-olds don't have a clue what they're interested in. You knew. What was it about history that even grabbed you then?
Well, it really started very early in my life.
He did indeed. Earle says he remembers a trip with his parents to Quebec when he was only 6.
And I spotted an antique shop in Bingham. And I said, please, on the way back, can I stop there? Can we go in there and see what they have? And indeed, that was the first time that I shopped in an antique store.
At 6 years old?
I was 6. And then I found something that I wanted, a print of George Washington.
And he's been studying Maine's history ever since.
I think the fascination with pursuing history, whether it's at the local, the state, or the national level, is simply that one never exhausts the richness of it.
Earle's love for the past grew just as Maine was rediscovering our state's rich history. He became involved early in Portland and then statewide, working with the new Maine Historic Preservation Commission, eventually leading it and becoming an expert on Maine's historic buildings.
This has been the role of historic preservation and history, for that matter, in Maine, to make people aware of that, because these visible remains of the past, whether it's an individual building, whether it's a farmstead, whether it's, a wonderful preserved downtown like Hallowell, for example, all of these things are what define the character of Maine, that make Maine Maine, that make it special, that make it unique.
One house in particular has had his attention from the beginning. It's in his native Portland, the Victoria Mansion. Earle first saw it as a kid and came to know that it needed help.
For example, the gutter cornice system was all deteriorated and the water was pouring down on the brownstone and deteriorating it. The federal money was just beginning to come to the states for restoration projects in those days, in the early 70s. And I was on the board of the commission, and I said, there's a major building in Portland that is very much in need of restoration.
The money began to come in, he says, and the mansion gradually was brought back to life.
Because it is such an important building in terms of mid-19th century residential architecture in America. It is probably the most sophisticated and most well-preserved example of a Victorian Italianate villa-style house in the country.
That important?
That important, absolutely.
He's worked on scores, likely hundreds of other old buildings since then. All of them, he says, matter to Maine.
Why is it so important for our communities, for the state, to do this and save these things?
Well, I think it's multifaceted. I think that it's important, as I mentioned before, just simply for community and state identity. These are the buildings that are our history, they're our past, but they're also the living built environment that we experience every day. And it gets to the whole point of quality of life, really.
The quality of our lives, says Earle Shettleworth, is made better by seeing that the old things from the people who came before us are still here.
Well, Goodness, where does one begin after all of this?
Earl Shettleworth may be technically retired, but he still holds the post of Maine State Historian. And he still works every day doing research and helping local groups discover their own histories. He says there are still a lot of stories of Maine's past just waiting to be shared.
Earl Shuttleworth says he believes interest in preserving Maine's history remains strong.
He said, "I think the past has a future in Maine."